El Shaddai by Kenneth E. Hagin. In El Shaddai, Kenneth E. Hagin invites readers into one of the most intimate and powerful revelations of God's character, the God who is not merely sufficient but more than sufficient. The book carries the emotional tone of reassurance, theological confidence, and spiritual boldness, insisting that believers live with the unshakable certainty that their God is enough for every need. El Shaddai explores one of the foundational covenant names of God revealed in Scripture and argues that this name reveals God's complete sufficiency for His people. Hagin's central thesis is that understanding God as El Shaddai transforms the believer's expectations, faith, and daily spiritual experience. The book begins by establishing the biblical origin of the name, especially in God's covenant relationship with Abraham. It then examines the linguistic and theological meaning behind the term, emphasizing abundance, nourishment, and sufficiency. Hagin explains that God's names are not symbolic decorations but revelations of His nature and His promises. He argues that God revealed Himself as El Shaddai to assure His covenant partners of provision, protection, and fulfillment. The author also connects this Old Testament revelation to the New Testament believer, insisting that the covenant promises remain relevant today. Throughout the book, Hagin emphasizes that faith must be grounded in the revealed character of God. The work ultimately argues that spiritual maturity requires a correct understanding of God's nature. It presents El Shaddai as the foundation for faith, confidence, and victory. The reader is encouraged to replace anxiety with trust and limitation with expectation. By the end, Hagin presents the revelation of El Shaddai as transformative, not merely informative. Chapter 1. God reveals Himself as El Shaddai. The first chapter establishes the biblical foundation of the name El Shaddai, focusing primarily on Genesis 17:1, where God introduces Himself to Abram as El Shaddai. Hagin argues that this moment represents a turning point in redemptive history. Abram faced the impossibility of fulfilling God's promise through natural means, yet God responded not by explaining the method but by revealing His nature. According to Hagin, this reveals a crucial theological principle: faith is built on knowing who God is. Hagin emphasizes that God's revelation of His name was intended to inspire confidence in His ability to perform the impossible. He explains that Abram's situation required supernatural intervention, and God responded by presenting Himself as the God of more than enough. A key quote captures this emphasis: God did not give Abraham a method. He gave him a revelation of His nature. When you know who God is, you can trust Him regardless of circumstances. Hagin argues that this revelation shifted Abram's perspective from human limitation to divine sufficiency. The chapter concludes by stressing that believers today must also understand God's revealed nature if they expect to live by faith. Chapter 2. The meaning of the name. This chapter explores the linguistic, symbolic, and theological meaning of El Shaddai. Hagin explains that the name conveys the idea of nourishment, sufficiency, and provision. He emphasizes that the name portrays God as the source of life and sustenance. Hagin argues that El Shaddai reflects God's role as the provider and sustainer of His people. He highlights that this name emphasizes relationship rather than distance. God is not merely powerful, but personally invested in His covenant partners. He writes, El Shaddai means God is enough. He is not barely sufficient, He is abundantly sufficient. This chapter expands the reader's understanding of divine provision beyond material needs to include emotional, spiritual, and relational sufficiency. Chapter 3. Covenant and Sufficiency. This chapter explores the relationship between covenant and provision. Hagin argues that God's covenant guarantees His faithfulness. He explains that God's provision is rooted in His covenant promises. He emphasizes that covenant is not merely symbolic but binding. God's covenant reflects His character. A key insight appears here: God's covenant is the guarantee of His sufficiency. He does not promise without providing the means of fulfillment. Hagin emphasizes that believers must see themselves as covenant participants. Chapter 4. El Shaddai and the believer today. Hagin connects Old Testament revelation with New Testament believers. He argues that God's nature has not changed. The same God who was El Shaddai to Abraham remains El Shaddai today. He writes, God has not lost His power. He has not lost His willingness. He is still El Shaddai. This chapter emphasizes continuity between covenants. Chapter 5. Living in the reality of El Shaddai. The final chapter focuses on application. Hagin argues that believers must live with confidence in God's sufficiency. He writes, When you know God as El Shaddai, fear loses its power. The chapter concludes with encouragement toward faith and confidence. The structure is clear, logical, and progressive. Major themes include divine sufficiency, covenant relationship, faith and identity. Hagin's style is clear, pastoral, and persuasive, similar to Andrew Murray, E.W. Kenyon. This book will benefit Christians seeking deeper faith, theology students, pastors,